Welcome back, everyone, to Stone for Development, Day 6. Once again, before we get started, please remember to keep your microphone muted and put your questions and comments in the chat. So today we have a special guest, my colleague, Dr. Paul Rogers, who is a development expert, is going to talk about theories of development and sustainable development as it relates to development minerals. The agenda is going to be that we're going to watch a couple of videos and have some conversation. And then he's going to give us a quick PowerPoint on Bretton Woods. Then we're going to break into groups, and you're going to summarize those development theories for us and give us a presentation. And then we'll talk about what we're going to do tomorrow. But first, we have a little fun exercise. I'll share my screen for a minute. Right above the webinar, where you get into the webinar, there is a word cloud exercise. So for 5 minutes, if you would just type in 3 words into the word cloud, and we'll see what you come up with. And the question was, what 3 words would you put in for what human or economic development means to you? So I'll just stop sharing so you can get into your own page there and just type in 3 words for us, and then give you 5 minutes. Okay, here we go. Okay, that's great. We have 53 words. You can probably see them as well. Look like some of the bigger, most popular words were equality, health, growth, and progress. And then next would be
well-being.
Yep, well-being. Watch your mute there. We got let's see. Yep, well-being would be next. Economy. And then all the rest are smaller. Happiness, inclusion, equal opportunity, inclusivity, rewarding life. This is a good one. Quality of education, state of lives, long and healthy life. Culture, ideology, empowerment. Lots of good ideas there for what development means to you.
So I think one of the things you can see from the word cloud, everybody, is that most people are interpreting development not in strictly economic terms. People are looking at development in terms of health and well-being, in terms of prosperity, satisfaction, improvement, environment, gender equity. So these are very much, I guess the way I think of development and others think of development, but it's certainly not the dominant framework within which development occurs today, although the UN, of course, is focused on human development. And we can get into that theory a little bit later on. But this is just a little exercise to get you loosened up. I know that many of you probably won't know too much about development theories. So in a way, this may be like back to undergrad days or back to uni or school days. But really the aim of this exercise is to get you guys to know where current sustainable development approaches and theories come from, and some of the ideas that have informed development over time, particularly since the World War II period until now. And you'll see, we started out with classical economics, and then we've gone through different kind of socialist phases in Latin America, and then neoliberalism, which is the common paradigm right now, but it's certainly not hegemonic. It's being challenged, that paradigm, on multiple fronts, not the least is by China, but also within our own country. So we'll get into a little bit of that later on. And hopefully you've each chosen a development theory that is interesting to you, that might shed light on some of the challenges of the development mineral sector today. So on that note, I think we're going to show a couple of videos on neoliberalism and globalization. I'm sure all of you have heard a little bit about what neoliberalism is, but this will give you a really good overview of its core characteristics and objectives. So over to you, Gary, to show the videos now. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Yeah.
Neoliberalism is a term for the political and economic policies associated with unrestrained free market global capitalism. The term was popularized in the 1980s by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and economist Milton Friedman, and is still prominent today. Proponents of neoliberalism see free markets and free trade as a foundation for human flourishing, creating the most favorable conditions for individual liberties, job growth, technological innovation, and transnational collaborations that promote peace and global prosperity. They believe that government interference with free market systems promotes waste, inefficiency, and stagnation. They reject regulations on industries, high taxation, and public services that are not subject to market competition, and believe in shrinking the size of government and restricting its functions to the protection of private property through policies and law enforcement, the facilitation of global commerce, and the maintenance of a strong military. Critics of neoliberalism argue that neoliberal policies exacerbate rather than mitigate economic and social inequalities. They cite the effects of unregulated capitalism and the reduction or removal of safety nets typically provided by governments to support those who are economically and socially vulnerable. More fundamentally, many critics assert that neoliberalism fails to account for structural forms of violence, such as systemic poverty, racism, and other forms of discrimination. They argue that these hinder equal access to the benefits of free market capitalism that neoliberals imply are universally shared. By failing to acknowledge structural forms of oppression, many neoliberals assert that it is individual failings rather than systemic inequality that lead to social and economic vulnerability. As with other political and economic systems, religions function to both support and challenge neoliberalism in local, national, and global contexts.
Yeah, great. So that was the first little overview, guys, of neoliberalism. For some of you, it may be the first time you've gotten an in-depth, or at least a good oversight of what it's all about. So that was from Harvard X. The next one is from the University of Sydney, and it covers globalization and neoliberalism, a little bit more detail on neoliberalism, and an important topic to understand in terms of how we view the development mineral sector in today's economic and development environment. So back to you, Gary. You can start the next video.
What is the relationship between neoliberalism and globalization, and what impact has it had on societies at a national and local level? In this lecture, I'll provide some insight into the relationship between neoliberal market strategies, globalization, and social change. First, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is both an economic theory and a policy model. It emerged in the 1970s as a more radical form of classical liberal philosophy, which is most commonly associated with the 18th century Enlightenment thinkers John Locke and Adam Smith. These classical liberal thinkers advocated a separation of economics and politics and minimal government intervention in economic affairs and markets. Neoliberalism shares many ideological similarities with classical liberalism, but its scope is global and much wider than classical liberalism. This is partly due to the re-emergence of liberal thought at a time when national economies were becoming more interdependent in a new era of economic globalization. As a result, advocates of neoliberalism also promote free trade policies and minimum barriers to the flow of goods, services and capital across national borders. There are a number of ideological and political tenets that underpin neoliberalism. These include an emphasis on individualism, self-interest, liberty, freedom of choice, the entrepreneurial spirit, economic growth, technical progress, and freedom for corporations to pursue economic advantage without state impediment. Under neoliberalism, the state is assigned a very limited economic role, such as defining property rights, enforcing contracts, and regulating the money supply. In essence, proponents of neoliberalism are deeply committed to the idea of a self-regulating market. They argue that as much as possible ought to be left to the market or to other processes in which individuals freely choose to take part. The practical implementation of neoliberal policies leads to a relocation of power from political to economic processes and from the state to markets and individuals. So, what exactly is the connection then between neoliberalism and economic globalization? Some scholars contend that processes of globalization help to create the ideal environment for neoliberalism to thrive and spread across the globe. Technological advancements made the movement of capital, information and trade across national borders much more fluid and facilitated the realization of the ideals of neoliberalism that had until that point existed only in academic economic theory. In order to survive in an increasingly global and interdependent climate, many governments began to adopt policies of economic liberalisation, including trade liberalisation by reducing tariffs and changing laws regulating trade and the privatisation of government institutions and organisations. Such policies give freer rein to markets and less control to the state, which is entirely in line with neoliberal ideas. On the other hand, other commentators argue that globalisation has been occurring for centuries and that it would be incorrect to assume that neoliberalism and globalisation have always gone hand in hand. John Gray, for example, observes that while we conceptualise globalisation today as being a particular type of neoliberal economic regime, that there's nothing inherent within globalisation that would require that that is the only form that economic globalisation can take. This is supported by theorists such as David Harvey, who contends that the dominance of neoliberalism as the contemporary economic regime is due to a successful endeavour by the rich and powerful to restore class power. Harvey argues that proponents of neoliberalism have successfully created a system that allows for the accumulation of wealth amongst a small minority, while blocking any measures for redistribution by a welfare state. Regardless of whether you believe that the relationship between globalisation produced the dominance of neoliberalism or is contingent or manufactured, it's undeniable that neoliberal ideology and policy is one that promotes the concept of globalisation and is arguably the dominant economic theory of our time. So what are some of the social impacts of neoliberalism? Internationally, there is much debate about whether neoliberal economic strategies imposed by institutions like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have reduced or in fact exacerbated global poverty. Proponents of neoliberalism have argued that neoliberal policies allowing for maximum economic growth help to bridge the gap between rich and poor. Ronald Reagan, for example, former President of the United States, promoted the trickle-down theory, the idea that wealth generated at the top by investors, corporate heads and entrepreneurs would eventually trickle down to the masses, and so the state doesn't need to implement policies for redistribution. In contrast, other advocates, activists and scholars such as David Harvey contend that in fact the exact opposite is true, and that the rich have simply become richer at the expense of the poor whose labour is exploited. There's also a fear that the globalisation of financial markets means that economic crises that occur out of policies that are primarily concerned with short-term economic growth will become more common and catastrophic because of the interdependence of global markets. At the national level, neoliberal ideology has had a dramatic effect on state structures and policies, which has led to sometimes contradictory outcomes. On the one hand, the neoliberal state is meant to step back and allow the market to self-regulate with only minimal government intervention where necessary. On the other hand, governments have often been complicit in aiding the market through the introduction of new laws and policies that provide significant infrastructural support for market activities. Along with Ronald Reagan, another political leader famously associated with neoliberalism was Margaret Thatcher, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. During their respective leaderships in the 1980s, they were both vocal proponents of neoliberalism and used their political power to enact neoliberal strategies such as economic liberalisation and the dismantling of the welfare state. As a consequence of these changes, the United Kingdom and the United States have seen the abolition or reduction of subsidies and tariffs, the privatisation of previously government-owned institutions, a sustained attack on unions, and a move towards user-pays systems of healthcare and education. The social impacts of neoliberalism have also been felt in Australia. Higher education is one example. Sociologist Raewyn Connell argues that since the Dawkins reforms of the 1980s, which included the introduction of fees for tertiary education, universities have become increasingly organised around competition in a global marketplace, rather than being orientated towards the public good of society. She contends that access to education has been commodified in Australia, as university degrees are now viewed not as an education, but as a commodity to be exported and sold, with their only benefit being improvement in graduates' earning capacity. By aiming to put a market price on all aspects of social life that were once governed by the logic of social advancement, neoliberal thinking has encouraged governments to value competition and profit above all else, and to weaken the role of other types of social principles such as altruism, cooperation, and community. Finally, neoliberalism has led to an increased focus on the individual, which means that concepts such as the public good and the community are less likely to be considered in policy discussions. Social issues like unemployment, inequality, and poverty are increasingly attributed to individuals rather than to structural factors. Such a worldview makes it easier to rationalise the idea that some people are much more deserving of wealth than others, which then justifies the fact that in practice, neoliberalism often benefits only a minority of people. In summary, neoliberalism is both an economic theory and a policy model that advocates minimal government intervention in global markets and economic affairs. Second, the current global economic system is underpinned by neoliberal ideology and has meant that the majority of countries the world over have adopted neoliberal policies and strategies into their own national agendas. Third, the dominance of neoliberal ideology has had significant effects on society at an international, national, and individual level. In Australia, higher education is only one example.
Over to you.
Okay, everybody. I wonder if that was new for many of you. What would be interesting is to get your thoughts in the comment box, or even raise your hands to make a few comments about neoliberalism and maybe the experience in your own countries. It would also be really good to think about or to start making some links between the development mineral sector and neoliberalism itself. And I think you may have been exposed in previous days to discussion about the priority that the current economic system places on export of high value minerals, such as iron ore and gold and copper and nickel. They're very much valued in neoclassical economics, or in the neoliberal system. They generate export earnings, foreign exchange earnings, sorry. But how do you think development minerals in the sector that is traditionally perceived to be low price commodities that aren't necessarily exported in great quantities, where do you think that that sector fits into the neoliberal system? So please feel free to answer those questions, or even just to make some general comments,
Comments in the chat.
whatever they are. So do we have some comments coming in? Let's see. I'm not receiving those, Gary.
Yeah, look in the chat.
Comments.
Okay. I can read them if you want.
Sure.
Okay, so the first comment, Paul wrote this one. Says, notice the comment about the relocation of power from politics to the economy. Now, that's very significant in neoliberalism. There's more power given to the market and to business typically than there is to government. And you'll hear, if you have a liberal party in your country, which is often called the Conservative Party, they will always poo-poo government and say that business is the answer, the market is the answer, and that government, Ronald Reagan used to say government is the problem, not the solution. So that's a typical liberal point of view. And then Raymond says, maybe George Orwell began his writing of Animal Farm from these theories. And if you remember the famous quote from that book, some animals are more equal than others. And neoliberalism tends to judge people according to their wealth. So that would certainly be true. And then Nico has a hand up, so I'll turn it over to Nico.
Sorry, well, okay, I can comment, but I would just like to point out that we have some problems with the audio since we have some echo.
Sorry, when
yeah,
when both of us have ours.
yeah. But anyway, so my comment would be, yeah, I am sort of somewhat aware of neoliberalism because I try to be aware of American politics. So I heard of the trickle-down economics from the different parties. So that would be my reference for the neoliberalism. In terms of development sector, development minerals, I think I'm not sure yet, but I think neoliberalism is not a good development principle when it comes to this sector. That would be my viewpoint.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. There's a couple more comments here in the chat. Foibe says the cutting down of safety for the individual traders. So that would be consistent with the idea that they would not support government regulation. That would be not favored in neoliberalism. It basically let business, self-regulate. Don't have business regulate. So they wouldn't have any kind of safety or pollution standards. That would be the ultimate for neoliberalism. So you're right. So there wouldn't be any kind of safety regulations for small business. Let's see. Aubrey says, will neoliberalism not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their own needs? Well, that's a good question. Does the unfettered market only meet the needs of this generation, or does it consider the future? That's a good question.
Just to add to bring this in to this question, Gary, or this issue, it's very interesting, I think, to note that the Sustainable Development Goals and the current discourse around sustainable development is actually situated in a neoliberal framework. So if you look at some of there's a role for the private sector in almost all of the SDGs, and SDG 17, partnerships for the goals. What does that imply? That implies partnerships with companies and corporations. So the question then becomes, is sustainable development truly achievable when the private sector is so fundamentally involved in development and in achievement of the goals? Some would argue that it's impossible to achieve sustainable development without corporations. I wonder what your thoughts are on this.
There's quite a few comments there in the chat. There's two hands up. So.
Well, let's go to some of the comments first. Let's see. Wu Begzier, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, says if the market is free and open,
he says call him
Wube, excuse me. If the market is free and open and international companies could engage and produce industrial minerals, they could produce and sell it to the short distances, or they can value add and export it. Yeah, I'll take that as a comment. Good observation. So Raymond said, when does neoliberalism start in the history days? So when did it actually become predominant? You could say the 1980s with the Washington Consensus, which was basically the adoption of a set of neoliberal principles, free trade, lack of government intervention, privatization, all those things really took off in the 1980s, and neoliberalism has been with us ever since. But it didn't actually take long for neoliberalism to really trigger a widespread amount of discontent, particularly in Western countries. If some of you are old enough, you'll remember the Battle of Seattle in 2000, 2001, where people were protesting the negative impacts of globalization. So the offshoring and loss of jobs, the movement of corporations to countries where there were low environmental standards, so companies could make more money. These were all considered the negative impacts of free trade and neoliberalism, the free flow of goods, services, and money. And that, of course, it refers to globalization. So globalization is the handmaiden of neoliberalism in that sense. Noel asked, is neoliberalism a suitable model for African countries? That's a very ideological question, I guess. My own view is that unrestrained, uncontrolled neoliberalism without government oversight to a significant degree is not a good model for any country. Now, Gary and I both say we're not Marxists, we are capitalists, but we do believe in government, a significant role for the state. Whereas the Reaganomics, Reagan and Thatcher and other neoliberals and the conservative movement today, they want to see the government out of the market, and they want to see government out of people's lives. So that's a good question. You have to ask yourself, how has neoliberalism unfolded in your own countries in Africa? Another comment from Alicia, I think especially in developing countries, we value foreign money more than local money. Yeah, good point. In order to actually initiate Stone for Development, we need to reevaluate our understanding of value to enable us to consider local development in its entirety. Value that may not easily be equated to foreign money. Excellent question. I think that's really one of the driving forces of the development minerals agenda that Daniel Franks, Professor Franks, and others at the UN and EU and the ACP have been involved with, is this idea that development minerals have a development potential that is not necessarily related to the value of the minerals that are produced. And of course, it's about using and processing those minerals locally to create maximum jobs, to skill people up, to create opportunities for new business. And there's no massive foreign exchange earnings from the sale of sand and aggregate. They're low price per volume, unit volume compared to the other minerals. So I think that's a really good point. And I hope you guys can think more deeply about that question. Good question, Alicia.
There's a couple of hands that have been up.
Oh, sorry, a couple of hands. My apologies. So Ndape, excuse me. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rogers. So I just wanted to say, I wanted to relate to.
And turn on your video so we can see you, please.
I'm sorry, not in a good mood this morning. So it's very early here. So we need to just
Okay, no problem.
All right. So within the context of development minerals, I think I'll take the case of Cameroon. We have some sort of pseudo-new liberalism, if I call it that way, because at some point you have government regulations, and then at another level, the negotiations or the trade dealings between the buyer or the seller, it's just liberate. So you sell at your price, and whoever is by negotiations. So the government doesn't have a real hand to state the amount you have to sell, the quantity of sand, the quantity of gravel or whatever. So the price, for example, is not regulatory. From one quarry site to another, the prices are different. So there we have the real experience of neoliberalism. But on the other hand, you have some level of government control in terms of administrative follow-ups and all of that. So I think for African countries, yes, neoliberalism or capitalism is going to be very effective, but I think there is a need for some level of government implication for stone or for development minerals to really be beneficial both to the communities and also to the government. So that's what I just wanted to bring in. Thank you.
Thank you, Ndape. That's a really, really good point. Thanks for your comments. I see a hand from Raymond. Would you like to say something, Raymond?
Yes, Professor Paul, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are.
Good afternoon here.
Yes, it's good morning in Uganda. Let me begin by asking a question, perhaps not for you, but for all of us and all those in this system of maybe research. I bring a concern, for example, in Africa, we have had plenty of minerals which are extracted, and we do not have the processing facilities in Africa, and these markets for these minerals are taken out to wherever they are being processed. Of course, when they're taken out, maybe even the byproducts are reused in other ways, which would have been better if these things would have been processed here in Africa. In the entire mineral sector in itself, I do not know which governments that are in control. Maybe in Australia it could be, but in Africa, it is privatized. And who is playing in the privatization? You still have the neoliberalism companies which are involved in buying and maybe processing in all this. At the top of the chain, you hear, I'm not an expert in this, but I hear, you have pharmaceutical companies which are even involved in the politics of some countries, bringing down governments, putting other governments, sustaining dictators. All these things put together. Really, do you see that this neoliberalism, even sustainable development, can help achieve these sustainable development goals? No. Why? Because I still have another question. Who is involved in designing these sustainable development goals? Which country that says much? And who is listened to? Where do we begin and where do we end? We moved from MDGs now to the sustainable development goals. What was achieved by MDGs and that SDGs will achieve? It is some level of replicas, and we may be still going to get other goals of some sort, moving from the sustainable development goals to other goals which we are yet to think. But maybe my view, and maybe becoming a politician, is that the academics could help in designing these models, looking at what works and what does not work. Because in other words, when we still have this neoliberalism hands of taking minerals out of Africa, being processed there, and they are brought back to be sold to us at a higher level, it is still going to be a big problem which cannot be achieved by sustainable development goals.
Mm-hmm. All excellent points. I won't speak to, I agree with much of what you've said. It's really, really important. The Africa mining vision, of course, which you would know about, Raymond, does seek to address some of those questions. However successful it's been is not up to me to really say, but obviously it's had its challenges. What about others? Does anybody else have, before we move on to the next questions or comments?
Quite a few comments.
Yeah, does anyone have any comments they'd like to make or responses to Raymond on that issue? No, let's move to Noel, who has got his hand up. But anyway, thanks, Raymond. Over to you, Noel.
Hello, guys. Good morning. Good morning or good evening.
Good morning, Noel.
Good.
Are you getting
Good
me?
afternoon. Yes.
Okay. I want to raise a point concerning neoliberalism and development in African countries. As we can notice from the general point of view of neoliberalism is that it promotes a free trade zone. And here in African country, you have a big problem because the industry is not really strong and developed. The industrial sector is not really strong and developed in African country. mostly in Cameroon. And this free trade zone promotes, make African countries are receiving a lot of goods from industrial country. And these goods are sold because of this free zone at a cheaper price than goods that are manufactured locally. So people prefer to buy those imported goods, and this is killing African local sector, industrial sector. Those local small artisans that promote that develop this the Javare sector. So this is a huge problem. We have to think about it. How to promote before going to this neoliberalism, to make sure that every country have the strong or the power to compete with each other between them. Unless this will kill this free trade zone, or this neoliberalism will kill local industry, and this will promote poverty and on the local point of view. This is what I want to say concerning the, like I can say the negative
Can I respond to that?
side of view of the neoliberalism. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary has a comment or response to make on that.
Yeah, if you just mute, then I can speak.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, you have to mute.
I've muted.
Yes, so that's a good point. And it has to do with you know, the idea in neoliberalism that there shouldn't be any trade barriers. And later we're going to talk about import substitution. And a lot of countries develop by protecting their local industries. I find it very hypocritical. A lot of the wealthy developed countries tell developing countries, throw open your borders, you know, let the foreign companies come in. But that's the exact opposite of what they did. If you look at South Korea, Japan, United States, they all had massive trade barriers, and they protected their domestic industries from foreign competition for a long time. And not only that, they also give them lots of subsidies. That's what happened to Mexico after NAFTA, is that the Mexicans couldn't compete with American corn, and all the corn, which is traditional to their culture, was decimated by imported cheap American corn. So exactly the same thing you talked about, where the cheap foreign goods come in. And so that the idea of protecting your own industries goes directly against the idea of free trade that's in neoliberalism. So that's my response to you there.
Good, thanks, Gary. So we have another comment from Laban. If neoliberalism would promote free trade zones for development minerals, it would be good. I guess, Gary, maybe you have some thoughts on this. I guess our interest in development minerals is in terms of the extraction and local use of those development minerals, because that's where most of the local development impact occurs. So establishing free trade zones for development minerals, I'm not sure that that's necessarily on our agenda as a program here at UQ, but Gary, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with you.
Yeah, okay, let's move on to another question from Asia. Neoliberalism has had effects in Fiji in shifting trade allies from Australia to China. Indeed, the sheer volume of trade that China engages in means that it's all of the traditional trade partners for Western countries, Australia being one of them, but even the US and the UK have moved to China. And, you know, it's funny because a lot of the sentiment, the government policy in this country, in Australia, is that Papua New Guinea and Fiji and Solomon Islands are very much Australia's backyard, and there are close allies and friends, but are clearly with much trade being undertaken and foreign investment too with China, that's changing, and the Australian government's particularly concerned about it given the geopolitical competition that's going on. All right, Gary, please keep your hands up, your eyes open for comments, for hands raised. Yeah. We have another question here from Wheeze. I think it should consider future needs for maximum profit and self-regulation with default to it ignoring future conditions. Wouldn't it be a good plan for a business? Right. I'm not sure how to respond to that. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
So a business typically has a a timeline of the next quarter of the year. They look like 3 months ahead typically. And the idea in the theory in sustainable development is that we should meet the needs of today without compromising the needs of the future. And that is not in the mind frame of business. They are looking for maximum profit today, and they are not really thinking about the future that much. So the idea of considering the future and profit maximization may not necessarily go together, except kind of incidentally. There is also a hand up.
Okay, let's see. There's tons of comments coming in. So hopefully it seems like this is an interesting topic for you guys. I'm trying to figure out what the last one was. Apologies if we are skipping any of your questions.
It was Wiz was the last one.
Wiz was the last one. Wow, there's quite a few coming in. There's some discussion between people on the board, which is good. I'm trying to go up again.
Just so you know, you have like 40 minutes left, and that's about
Yeah.
the agenda, that space that you left.
Yeah.
So at some point we might need to cut it off.
Okay, in which framework is sustainable development designed? This is Raymond again. Who has a say in the design? Whose ideas are taken? Well, I think, Raymond, I think we kind of touched on that before, that sustainable development, at least the sustainable development goals side of things, is very much framed in the, I guess, the neoliberal side, but it also has aspects which relate to human development theory as well. And for those of you that have taken an interest in that as your little homework last night, will understand what that means. Each of the 17 goals, many of them have human development aspects, rewarding employment for all, and also environmental aspects. Let's see, another question. Would protectionism fit more for Africa? That's Gus Day. I presume the question there is, should African countries adopt protectionist policies? That's a really good question. I think that African countries and Latin American countries have in the past adopted protectionist policies. And I think, as Gary pointed out earlier, all governments protect their industries to a degree. Like the US certainly protects its agricultural sector, and the Chinese certainly have protected all of their homegrown tech industries in particular, through subsidies and business controls and whatnot. I think it's finding a balance between government regulation and a capitalist free market. That's what governments rarely seem capable of doing. And perhaps part of that is to do with the power of corporations to influence governments. Anyway, so let's see. This is from is neoliberalism a cause of migration? I guess yes and no. I think that the push factors with migration are certainly probably the most the most important. And when I say push factors, I mean the poverty and corruption or violence that occurs in many countries. And I think you could look at the Middle East as an example of that. It's not really just about economic aspects. It's about human security and destabilization of countries. Yes, capitalism has played a role in that, and governments intervening in the Middle East on behalf of economic interests has certainly triggered that. More generally, I think the wealthy countries have attracted large numbers of migrants. And if you look at the US, for example, there are tens of thousands of people from Central America every month coming into the US in the hope of some opportunity and economic prosperity. Good questions. Aubrey asks, does neoliberalism allow for the rich to form an elite group that owns large shares of the world's wealth created by the masses of people of the world, but not that everyday people do not own any part? I'm not sure about the last, I understand the last part of the question, but clearly the critics of neoliberalism and neoclassical economics would argue that, and the videos kind of showed that the current capitalist system that exists has allowed wealth to accumulate. And even though poverty globally has declined, this is largely as a result of countries such as China pulling 800 million people out of poverty. That's had a huge impact. Some argue, yes, people are better off today, but the reality is there's a billion people in the world that are living at the very bottom of the economic and social and political ladder who haven't benefited from neoliberalism. Look, we have time for a couple more comments, and then we have to move on. It's great that you guys are so engaged in this topic. I hope it feels like your undergraduate days when you're with your tutors in the classroom and debating things. It's great. So this is Mujahid. How neoliberalism could promote economic development for developed and developing country as they are not equal level economically and technologically? Absolutely, a great point. It's interesting that China has managed to, and I come back to China because it's probably the most dominant economic force in the world right now, or is becoming one. China was very interesting. Its strategies are very interesting in the sense that it did require for advanced countries, companies to enter their markets, they did require technology transfer. So that's hardly a neoliberal policy. That was a very much a state intervention policy that enabled or facilitated the transfer of technology. Let's see. Yeah, inequality between countries. You'll see from some of the theories of development, particularly the neo-Marxist ones, the development theory, world systems theory, talk about core countries, the wealthy countries and the periphery countries. The argument is for many of those theorists that the wealthy, what they call the global north, so the USAs and the some Asian countries like Singapore and European countries, they developed in a very different environment where that environment where they had advantages, they had technological and economic and political power through such things as colonialism to be able to develop. And now we expect poor countries to do the same when in fact it's a totally different playing field. Maybe one more question. And then we have to move on to the next videos. So Lakshmi is agreeing with Noel. Aubrey is agreeing with Gary. Dape says, I think neoliberalism is good for development minerals since these minerals are mostly exported. It will promote local competition, though some government control is necessary. That's an interesting comment, Dape. I suppose whether or not development minerals are exported. Not exported. Well, he said they're not exported, or not mostly exported. Yeah, agreed. I suppose in some countries and some minerals, you do have a large export market, and particularly dimension stones. The Italian marble, for example, and granite. That is an export market. So yeah, but you're right. It's mostly consumed locally, and hence it has the most significant local development impacts. The question was, since the minerals mostly will promote local competition, though government control is necessary. Yeah, government intervention, I suppose, into the market is necessary in terms of supporting it. It's supporting its development. It's supporting the development of skills. We had a really interesting comment from a quarry owner in the first session this morning who mentioned that he had to bring in people from the Middle East to help with the marble that they were quarrying in the processing of the marble, because this person from the Middle East could do a job in 1 hour that the local people would take a week because they didn't have the skills. But then this is in, I believe, Uganda, when his company did train the local people, then they were much more productive and were able also to process the materials within an hour, similar to the expert that was brought in from overseas. So that's where government intervention is really necessary. All right.
We'll have a chance to talk about this again.
Yeah, we'll have a chance to talk about this a little bit later. So what we'll do now in the next half hour before we have a break is to show a couple more videos.
I think you wanted to do your
Oh, I'll do the,
first.
yeah, I can do that first. Okay. We'll do a quick presentation on what we call the Bretton Woods institutions. So what we mean by that is the World Bank and the IMF and why they're important for economic development in the global economic system right now. I won't take too much time. I'll run through these because we are getting a little bit short on time for this part of the session. So the Bretton Woods institutions. So I'll just share my screen. Where are we, Gary? Share screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen now? All right, good. Okay. All right, guys. So I lost my screen for a second there. So what was Bretton Woods and why was it important? So I think, I'm not sure if many of you would know what Bretton Woods was, but it was a conference that was held by the Allied nations. So the Allies in World War II, so the US and USSR and France, the UK, who came together with the aim of putting in place a system that would prevent the economic crises that had ravaged the world in the World War, and they didn't want that to ever happen again. And what the conference resulted, some of the outcomes of that conference were the development of some really important multilateral institutions that have been around since and continue to be very powerful and very influential in terms of economic development. So the first of these, you all would know this, is the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And skip ahead and I'll get into some detail about what these guys actually do. So the World Bank, when they talk about it, it's actually, they talk about it as one or two particular units, but it actually contains 5 institutions within the World Bank group. And that's the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, who many of you would know, and the IFC performance standards, the Multilateral Guarantee Agency, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that's GATT. Today, when we speak about the World Bank, we're really talking about the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Development Association. So the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, also founded in 1944, as its name indicates, was there to assist in rebuilding and developing Europe, which had been bombed into the, I guess you could say, that the dark ages during the war. Later on, the bank turned its attention to poorer regions of the world. And what it does today is provides loans to governments of middle income countries and credit-worthy poor countries at below commercial interest rates. And I'm sure that for some of you would have seen projects that are funded by the World Bank in your countries. The International Development Association is kind of the second main component of the World Bank, set up in 1960 to provide interest-free loans to the world's poorest countries. And as of 2020, it had lent $390 billion in the 60 years since 1960 to 1920. If you think about that quantity of lending, the Chinese development banks that have kind of come to challenge the World Bank, Bretton Woods institutions, they're lending a lot of money too. So it'll be interesting to do a comparison of those development agencies. Moving along to the International Monetary Fund, many of you would have heard this. So its aim was to maintain currency stability and develop world trade when it was set up in 1944. It provides advice to countries that are in financial difficulty. So one classic example of the IMF, and a potentially controversial example, is the Asian economic crisis of 1997. So that was when, Indonesia and Thailand and Malaysia suffered terrible economic crisis followed by high levels of debt. What the IMF does quite controversially in such cases is to introduce a set of policy prescriptions as a conditions of loan. So in other words, if Indonesia was struggling in 1997, the IMF comes in and says, yes, we can bail you out with loans, but you must implement structural adjustment programs. So these are policy prescriptions that governments are expected to implement in their countries. And they're supposedly intended to balance government budgets, you know, to address the debt situation, reduce inflation, and stimulate economic growth. However, as many of you would know, they're very controversial for a variety of reasons, particularly the austerity, price control aspects of structural adjustment and cutting government spending, which often impacts the poorest of communities, reduction of the role of the state in the economy, so privatizing state assets. You know, does that really benefit the local people who rely on jobs in state-owned corporations, for example? One good aspect of structural adjustment, I suppose you could say, is the focus on governance and fighting corruption. And to this day, the World Bank Group, that remains a really key feature of its activities. Look, we'll leave it there. So thanks for that. And I will stop sharing my screen. And Gary, I think we'll move on to the next videos.
Sure.
So the first video we're going to watch is on, essentially it's about dependency theory, world systems theory, inequality, some historical perspective on these approaches that kind of existed before the current neoliberal system and do offer some lessons for development today. So over to you, Gary.
What drives global economic inequality? What keeps poorer countries from developing? Economists, sociologists, politicians, historians, the World Bank, whoever it may be, they all have trouble defining inequality, let alone getting to the root of its causes. While most agree that in recent years we've seen a global economic convergence, that is to say that most countries are catching up, however slowly, with the developed world, they do also highlight the problems in measuring and confirming that convergence, and they highlight that many countries, what Paul Collier calls the bottom billion, are being left behind, and in some cases getting worse. This graph shows the share of world GDP between developed and emerging countries evening out over the last 15 years. But it should be noted that while many societies are getting richer, inequality within those societies is frequently on the rise, and the bottom billion countries, countries like Afghanistan, Angola, Azerbaijan, Benin, Bhutan, Bolivia, Burkina Faso, and Burundi, to name a few, are falling behind. The question, of course, is why? During the Cold War, with the world split between capitalist and communist ideologies, two distinct trains of thought emerged. The first, represented primarily within the Western world, was modernization theory, that given the right circumstances and inclusion into the global capitalist market, a country would progress through to modernity. This, of course, was a general theory that umbrelled many ideas like Rostow's 5 stages of growth. But the general consensus with these ideas was that capitalism is good. The second, capitalism is bad, was structuralism. Structuralism, in its many forms, maintained that it was the very structures of the capitalist system that prevented these poorer economies from developing, and that in many cases they were being exploited by richer countries and societies who were sometimes claiming to help. Structural adjustment programs, or SAPs for example, were and still are loans provided by the IMF and World Bank, both of course capitalist institutions, to countries on the basis that public assets would be privatised and free market reforms implemented. This, its detractors claimed, was little more than capitalist bribery. And who benefits from the reforms? Multinational corporations and businesses based in the West. Structuralism in international relations was mainly divided into two schools: dependency theory and world systems theory. Dependency theory, associated primarily with Latin American countries, asserts that in the capitalist system, resources tend to flow from the periphery, that's poor, underdeveloped countries, to the core, the wealthy Western world. This is because poorer countries, the periphery, tend to provide the natural resources and cheap labour for products designed and sold by businesses in the richer countries, the core. This leads to a unilateral flow of capital, which is simultaneously maintained by the politics, finance, education, culture, and sometimes military of the core. In Marxist terms, that's the superstructure. Think Nike, a cultural icon, opening sweatshops in Bangladesh, and you have the general idea. In other words, the rich countries oppress the poor countries. It's not hard to see why this theory held a lot of sway in the 60s and 70s, with the US backing dictators like Augusto Pinochet in Chile because of his free market beliefs. This, of course, was the height of the Cold War, and keeping communism at bay was at the top of the US agenda. The second structuralist school of thought was world systems theory. World systems theory, developed by the American sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein, builds upon, but also fundamentally differs from, dependency theory. In world systems theory, any analysis of world history and economic development should be studied from the position of the total world system, not through individual states or isolated events. This is because it's the very nature of the world system that creates inequality. For Wallerstein, there are still core and periphery countries, but there are also semi-periphery countries, which represent developing periphery countries and declining core countries. In his analysis, Wallerstein sees history in cycles through which a hegemonic core emerges, like the US or previously Britain and before that the Netherlands, which then for a period dominates the capitalist system. For Wallerstein, though, it's not necessarily rich countries that exploit poorer ones, but capitalists exploiting workers in core and periphery countries. For both dependency theorists and world systems theorists, it's the world capitalist system as a whole that leads to inequality and poverty, and the cure for all structuralists is some form of communism. Both of these schools of thought have mostly fallen from favour in recent years, although world systems theory is still popular among Marxists. And I think this has happened for two main reasons. Firstly, communism in its various applications has mostly failed. You just have to look at the Soviet Union, Cambodia, Cuba, North Korea, and the capitalist reforms in China, to name a few, and compare them to the economic growth in the Western world to see whether capitalism or communism has lifted the most people out of poverty. Which leads to the second point. People are being lifted out of poverty. It would take an ardent cynic to claim that the world, despite its huge problems, isn't slowly becoming a better place. So maybe the problem isn't the capitalist system as such, but maybe how you interact with and are a part of that world system. Maybe it's exclusion from the system or malpractice within it that leads to stagnation and poverty. This is certainly the argument of Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, whose work in the book Why Nations Fail aims to show that it's the inclusiveness of political institutions which determine whether nations succeed or fail, and that democratic, pluralistic systems with strong and guaranteed laws encourage their populations to innovate and build successful businesses and lives. Why Nations Fail uses the example of two of the world's richest men, Carlos Slim and Bill Gates, to show how wealth created through business innovation in a society with political and economic institutions conducive to the encouragement of innovation sparks the creation of further innovation, further jobs, further ingenuity, and further technical progress, which benefits all in that society, i.e. Bill Gates and the United States. On the other hand, wealth created through monopolistic activity or resource extraction, encouraged by what they call extractive institutions, make a few elites in the country richer while keeping the majority of the population in poverty. In systems like this, unstable laws, bribery and corruption all prevent citizens from having the courage and encouragement to start businesses and take positive risks to improve their lives. This sort of monopolistic culture, which the telecommunications giant Carlos Slim represents, doesn't spread innovation and development like the invention of the Windows PC did, and so leads to wealth in a country being isolated in the hands of the few, an elite. In The Bottom Billion, Paul Collier points to traps that affect the growth of poor countries. Civil war, or risk of civil war, bad governance and bad neighbours can all hugely affect a country's potential, and ironically, so can being rich in natural resources. The discovery of a large supply of a natural resource like oil can mean a few things for an impoverished nation. First, potential conflict over that supply. Second, a government which benefits from a large influx of capital from natural resources may not have to tax their citizens so highly, which equals less accountability from happy citizens, which equals a higher chance of government corruption. And third, Dutch disease, where a country's reliance on a single commodity makes other industries less competitive and less likely to thrive. An even bigger problem if that resource runs out or becomes less valuable. All of this points towards the idea that it's exclusion from the structures of the capitalist model that's the primary cause of poverty, not inclusion or dependence. Now, that's not to say that dependency doesn't occur, and that dependency theory can't tell us something about the faults of the capitalist system. In his 1978 study, for example, Gary Jeraffe shows how transnational pharmaceutical corporations took control of the Mexican steroid industry in the 1950s. At the time, Mexico was the subject of much pharmaceutical focus because of the wonder drug properties of the native Barbasco plant, which was important for the production of anti-inflammatory drugs and cheaper birth control pills. The corporations would harvest the Barbasco in Mexico and sell it on to a sister company owned by the same corporation at a much lower price than it was worth. The profits would then be moved out of Mexico and declared in tax havens like Puerto Rico and Panama. This is called transfer pricing. Eventually, Mexico nationalized the gathering, processing and sale of Barbasco and fixed the price for sale to the TNCs, but this didn't happen until 1975, some 20 years later. I think what Jeraffe's study shows is that, yes, situations of dependency and exploitation do of course occur, but this is not a systemic inherence of capitalism. It's social, and solutions can be found that can create an even and fair playing field around the world, and people like Collier and Acemoglu are replete with practical steps that governments, countries and societies can take. Collier, for example, reminds us that while elections are incredibly powerful in bringing about change in underdeveloped nations, the second part of the democratic process, checks and balances, are more important and frequently overlooked. Checks and balances within government are an ongoing process that help to highlight and discourage corruption. In Peru in the 1990s, the corrupt government of Alberto Fujimori was brought down by the only one of 10 television stations that Fujimori had not bribed for nearly $1 million a month each. Freedom of speech and transparency is obviously key. Collier suggests that emphasis should be placed on radio being kept from government control and freed from government restraints on entry. Radio stations are cheap to set up, and once they're running, there are likely to be too many of them for corruption within government to control or manipulate. He also suggests budget transparency from the bottom, audits of schools and hospitals, etc., instead of from the top, to help ensure funding and finance reaches its intended destination. So, of course, circumstances of dependency do occur, and structuralism in its many forms can tell us much about the approaches we can take to understand the issues that global inequality and unfettered neoliberalism presents. But I think practical solutions are more likely to be found in the studies of those trying to solve the issues, rather than those who simply speculate on the negative aspects of a model of free trade and openness that has lifted billions out of poverty. If you like these videos and would like to support me making more, you can follow me on Twitter.
Yeah, look, I was very impressed by the conversation going on in the chat box. So many of you have got really engaged with these issues and asking about the impacts of inequality and how that differs between the US and other countries, checks and balances, corruption. Great questions. I suppose we can have a few minutes to make some responses. I encourage people, if anybody wants to put their hand up to say a few things about any of the comments in the chat box, please do. Anybody like to make any verbal comments? Hands up if you do. Hang on there. Gary, are you screening for us?
Yeah, would you like me to call on people?
Yeah. We can just pick some of the comments.
Yeah, well, there's a couple with their hand up.
Ah, okay, good. So Wu Bei or Raymond?
Yes.
Wu Bei, why don't you go first and then we'll have Raymond. Thanks, Raymond.
Yes, it would seem to me that everything is affected by neoliberalism and that it's all over the world, and as a result, most poorer countries have also adopted it to the detriment of the people of that country.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would support that sentiment, Aubrey, for sure. And if you look at the most successful countries, particularly China, in terms of poverty alleviation, it's not necessarily a neoliberal system at all. It's got elements of capitalism. What is Deng Xiaoping's saying is capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Was that it, Gary? I think that was his statement. Wu Bei, you have your hand up. Would you like to make a comment? Can you turn your mute off, your microphone?
Okay. I want to raise some points about especially the limitation of capitalism. That means the neo-liberalism system, especially when there is a huge difference in terms of the initial capital. Even though there is a free market and free competition, is it possible to have a fair development possibilities both for the poor society and for the rich ones, because they will have a preference due to their initial capitals? And the second point will be, is there any law or principle that will guide the competition, that means the free market in the developed world? Those are my points. Thank you.
Gary, did you catch the first point? I can comment on the second point.
Go ahead.
On Wu Bei's. Well, I didn't catch the full part of your first point, Wu Bei. I believe
my first point is about the initial capital. That means the initial background of the society. When there is a pure free market system, it will promote the competition, but the initial background will be very important. If it is not regulated, or if there is no ways to for the common goods, it will create a huge gap when there is a competition. And is there any possibility to balance this? Yeah, I accept the neoliberalism system is good for development. I agree with that, but can we have some pointers about the initial capital? That is the first question that I raised.
You want to answer that, Gary?
Yeah, just need you to mute.
Yes,
The best way I think I can answer that is to talk about the way some of the Asian countries developed, and they had what are called virtuous cycles of development. And I think these virtuous cycles, and some of them started out as very poor countries, and virtuous cycles consist of focusing on education of your population and a low amount of inequality, good governance, and investing in government investment in local industry. And those are some of the what I so-called virtuous cycles, and all of the Asian tigers followed a similar path. South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they all did the same thing. They put and so did China, massive amounts of money into education, raising the level up, and investment in local business. And as I said, a certain amount of protectionism. So those are some of the virtuous cycles. There may be some others. I don't have my notes in front of me, but there are virtuous cycles of development. So that would respond to your first question, and you had a second one as well.
Sorry, I think Gary covered both aspects of your question there. Does that answer your question? Wu-Bei?
Yeah, the second question is about the reliance on one specific commodity. This is about, for example, in the case of Ethiopia and in my country, we basically relied on the agricultural goods, and we forget the remaining one for almost 30 years. And but right now they try to promote other sectors. This will be a problem. And but my question is that when we have countries which are least developed, and they will have certain commodities to promote to the market.
Gary.
What's that?
You're sharing your screen.
Yeah, I know that's.
Sorry, carry on.
That is really a major problem in poor countries, this reliance to one specific commodity. But how can they do, since they didn't have an option for other commodities? So the only thing they can do will be that they will deliver the market that what they have. So is there any way to balance this one also?
Yeah, it's a very very good question, and it's one I think that economists have thought about long and hard for many years. I guess in the case of Ethiopia, what I think you're suggesting is that traditionally there's been a large agricultural sector, and that is the predominant sector. I think that, you know, I guess the job for governments and economists is to look at the other assets, the other capitals, we call them, human capital, financial capital, these other capitals, what exists within a country like Ethiopia that can be developed through economic policy and regulation and state support. You know, Ethiopia, for example, has obviously a large agricultural sector, but it also has amazing national parks and wildlife. That's another, an environmental capital. So I think, you know, the question is about focusing in on what the capabilities are within that country. You know, there are some people that have argued in the past that countries should focus on sectors that they are their competitive advantage and leave other sectors to other countries. I think, you know, you look at Australia, for example. What does Australia have? It primarily has, you know, primary materials. It has minerals and it has agriculture. But Australia over time has developed its human capital, its people, through education, through training. And so beyond the primary materials, the primary exports, Australia has developed a biomedical research industry. It's developed an education industry. It's developed financial services, legal services, and of course, there's tourism as well. You know, the Australian economy is really not that complex or that complicated. If you look at it, you know, I don't know what percentage, but a significant proportion of GDP is accounted for by maybe 5, 6, 7 sectors. But your question is a great one. I'm actually not an economist. I'm more of a development theorist, but you know, there are friends of mine that would have a view on that. Let's,
I have a comment on that.
Gary, have a quick comment on that before we move to the final comment, and then we'll go to the next video. Gary, do you want to?
Yeah, we'll be. As far as diversification, you're absolutely right. Our reliance on one commodity is really can be a problem. I'll give you a great example. In the Caribbean, they were highly dependent on the banana industry, which was great because they had lots of independent banana producers. But then I think it was Chiquita took it to the World Trade Organization because Britain had most favored trading status. They gave favoritism to their former colonies. They were buying bananas at a higher price than they were selling them in Central America, where they have these massive plantations where they grow bananas much cheaper. And so they took it to, they said, this is an illegal restraint of trade. And so they made the special pricing that Britain was paying illegal, and they completely destroyed the Caribbean banana industry. It went from like 90% of the economy to 10%. So being reliant on one commodity is definitely not a good idea. So diversification is very important. Then what happened is they switched from bananas to tourism, and once again, highly dependent on one industry. So you raise an extremely important point about diversification. We're a bit over time, but I think Raymond has one last comment. So go ahead, Raymond.
Thank you, Gary and Dr. Paul. In fact, I have one question and an observation, a general observation, that these lectures have enlightened me from being a scientist I was. Now I'm beginning to think of being a politician and then see what change impact that I can do. Maybe I'm not sure if I can do this at a global scale. But what I see is that in all this, the neocolonialism, the neoliberalism, the structuralism, the whatever they are, all these things are still going on concurrently. And I still do not understand what is it that we want to do with them if it's an arm of business to some powers that be. Because, for example, if you looked at during the pandemic, Africa was struggling to access the vaccine, maybe even medicine, wherever it was. You have to go through, maybe if you have an alliance with US to help you access some of this information, or you have to go through Australia to help you as a country to access. Even as we talk, some countries do not have enough vaccine. They have not access to this. So whatever it is, structuralism, dependence theory, all those are still happening. But what do we want to do with them, and how best can we change this? In fact, for me, I still emphasize that academics collect more data, publish more research, and perhaps share this in the framework of the UN and say, this is what is happening and this is what you must do. Lastly, I am asking a question. Who is controlling the powers of China? In the case of this peripherism or COA or anything in this program, because this seems to be taking Africa back into the level of slavery where we were maybe 100 years ago. We seem to be going back into that because when you look at, for example, as we talk, our airport, the Ugandan airport, we hear they have taken it over a loan of $300 million. Who is going to pay this money? Even then, how was this, who took it? Some people are not aware. The local people who are paying the taxes are not aware. Who is controlling these powers of China? Why are we again even buying the Chinese products? Yet China was not a signatory of the CDM, of the Kyoto Protocol. Who is investing in China to do all these things? Why can't we limit China powers through these global protocols, treaties, and everything? Because wherever they go, they are becoming non-compliant. Isn't that a double standards?
Really good points. I've heard similar things from other people that when I've worked overseas in Papua New Guinea, for example. I would say to you, Raymond, that we could have a whole webinar on those questions, and I don't think we can answer them adequately in the time that we've left. But really interesting thoughts. Yes, is China engaging in a new form of neo-colonialism in Africa? Many people would say yes. So that's a huge question, a huge problem, a huge challenge for Africa. Anyway, let's move on to the final video. We'll watch that, have a couple of comments, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back for some group work. So Gary, if you can start the final video.
Raymond, you're not following the rules. I mean, the neoliberal rules say that you have to keep your borders open and allow the free flow of capital. So if you want to stop the flow of capital from China, then you're just not following the neoliberal rules. So you just be aware of that.
Thank you, Gary. But
I found my slide on virtuous cycles, and I left one out. High savings rate was the other thing, and they put a massive investment in education and also in investment in physical capital for their industry. And they did do export-led development, which is not what we're talking about. We're talking about local development. But this is how they did it. That was an answer to Wu Bei. Okay, we'll just show the video, and that will be the end of this part of the session. Sorry about that. It had the other screen showing. Hopefully this will work now.
This report is really responding to the various commitments that have been made over time within the UN and by all its member countries to address and eradicate gender inequalities. What this report provides, I think, is the rationale for why these commitments should be taken seriously and the losses to both individuals and societies of not taking these commitments seriously. The rationales lie in the evidence that has been compiled very carefully over several decades of research. They tell us that when we equalize, when we promote women's access to economic and financial resources, these are much more likely to be invested in the welfare of the next generation and the education of the next generation. We know that when women have access to resources, they are much more likely to be productive. They are the livelihood activities in which they engage are likely to yield higher returns. We know also there are strong microeconomic efficiency arguments that agricultural growth is likely to respond better when women have some say and access to resources about their farms and their firms. And we know there is a macroeconomic efficiency argument as well. And that is cross-country studies over time all show that gender equality contributes to economic growth, equality in education and equality in labor force participation. But there are reasons for concern, and that is economic growth does not seem to have quite the same positive impacts on gender equality. We do not find quite the same positive story that countries that have higher rates of growth also report progress on women's well-being, their health, and their voice in economic and political decision-making. In fact, we know that maternal mortality has remained one of the most intransigent of the MDGs to report progress on. So I think we need to look beyond some of the real gains that women have made in the labor market and in education, and ask what are the nature of the constraints that continue to keep women within inferior positions in the labor market, and therefore dependent on sometimes unreliable husbands, sometimes unfair states. We want to develop arguments that will promote women's access to resources so that they have more control over their own lives, so that they are able to negotiate fairer relationships, and so that they can participate in decision making. So, should I end there? So, just to capture very briefly what the report covers, we have looked at all the different areas in which this question of access to resources is important. We have looked at labor markets, employment, and asked what should be done to promote women's progress in the labor market. Not just poor women, but also educated and better off women. And these inequalities are not peculiar to poorer countries. We see them in the North as well. We've asked the kinds of training that we need, and we've asked for attention to women's unpaid care responsibilities, because that to some extent lies at the heart of the asymmetrical way in which macroeconomic policies are developed, since they only recognize women's paid work. We've also looked at the whole area of natural resources, including land, including water, technology, and housing, and so on. All the different forms of property, private, public, and common property, that would enable women to be far more productive in their daily livelihood activities. We've addressed the question of financial services, and we've asked that we go beyond microfinance. Microfinance has played a very important role in overcoming some of the constraints that women have faced in access to financial services. But the impact evaluations from microfinance across the world tell us that it is simply not enough to give small amounts of money to women and expect them to become equal players in the market. We need to open up access to the broader financial services, and we need to put far more emphasis on financial services apart from credit. We need to look at insurance, and we need to look at savings. And finally, we have looked at social protection. And this, of course, has taken on a particular urgency in the present time because of the crisis. But social protection is needed in normal times as well, because risk, vulnerability, and uncertainty are exacerbated by crisis, but they are a part of everyday lives, particularly of poorer people. So we have examined some of the demands, for instance, the ILO is making about a global social floor, and we've unpacked the different elements of the floor and asked, how can these different elements be made more gender sensitive? So that really is, and as Carolyn has said, what we've tried to do is show that single interventions on their own don't go very far. What we need is a comprehensive package that looks at the connections between paid and unpaid work, production and reproduction, formal and informal, and North and South.
Okay, thank you for all your great conversation in the first half, and we'll take a 10-minute break, and we'll see you after that. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had enough time for your discussion.
No, not at all. There was not nearly enough
Not
time.
enough time as well.
No.
Starting to get into it.
The time was too little.
Well, okay, hopefully you'll be able to give us something productive. You were just starting with, so shall we give them more time? Do you want to give them more time?
5 more minutes.
So would you like 5 more minutes? Okay.
Yeah,
here we
thanks,
go.
Gary. I think it will
All
be
right, well-
good for the team.
Okay, I'll put you all back where you were.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We have room 1, conventional theories, room 2, neo-Marxist theories, room 3, critical theories. So let's see if we can get room one to tell us about the conventional theories. Who would like to talk to us?
Yeah, from room one, we discussed about the. Can you hear me, Gary?
Yes, I can hear you. Good, fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, we discussed about the classical and the modernization theory, and slightly we touch also the neoliberalism theory, and we discuss about certain points, and we mention out two basic questions. The one is about the how do we define modernization? It should be defined in the context of a Western culture. That means what are the parameters that we consider to be a modern society or a civilized society? That is the first question that is raised from the group. And the second point will be about the context of this development minerals in the context of neoliberalism. That means if from the previous video and the discussion, I got neoliberalism promotes the individualism. And we know these development minerals are being operated by a collection of peoples or associations. And how do we manage that? That will be other point that we mentioned out. And more or less, even though the classical theory and the modernization theory and the neoliberalism theory, they deals about the possibilities about this free market policy, and if this free market policy promotes the competition, it will give a better chance for the society, and it will be economy driven instead of power driven. That is the point that we discussed. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that. All right, so some really interesting comments in there, particularly the one about modernization theory. Yeah, it does. It does reflect a set of Western values, I guess, and it also assumes a linear stage of growth from traditional all the way through to modern, developed capitalist industrial an industrial system. So I think you've raised really good points. Modernization for who, on what values? Would anybody like to comment on Wubei's summary for the first category, the conventional economic theories?
Ndape has his hand up.
Ah, Ndape, please feel free to comment.
All right, thank you very much. So we were in the same group, and I just wanted to add up something to what he said. There is this context of us perceiving neoliberalism like something that is bad, and that's one thing I really wanted us to think about. Within the context of development minerals, I think the classical economic theories as a neoliberal theory is very, very important and essential. If we take, for example, in countries where we export dimension stones, so the free trade makes every African country or the countries that have these development minerals to have some pressure to produce what is of quality, because if it's not of quality, you won't export and you won't have the good market. So it gives some sort of economic pressure that makes you to think about standardization, think about norms and all of that. So that is a very good advantage. So on the other hand, within the national context, like I said earlier, most of these development minerals are not exported generally. Sand, gravel, and all of that, most are consumed locally. So the free trade makes a very good competitive environment for each and everyone involved in the sector to really, boost their own products and make it more profitable. And that's why I said earlier on that some level of government influence is going to make the sector far better. So that's just one thing I wanted to point out. I don't think we should really have it in the back of our minds that neoliberalism just focuses on making people, the rich getting richer, you know, more of the capital and all of that. No, I think that there are so many advantages that comes in with neoliberalism, and within the context of development minerals, I think it's one of the ideal development systems which we can apply. So that's what I just wanted to add.
Look, I think that's a really, really good point. I suppose there's a reason that the neoliberal system has lasted so long, and that is it has delivered prosperity for many regions. I guess the question about how is not about whether you accept all of the principles of neoliberalism. It's under what conditions and what role of the state needs to play. I think, you know, one of the other theories that you guys didn't focus on, I guess, is Keynesian economic theory, which sees a significant role for the state within a capitalist system. And that generally lost favor in the 1970s and 1980s. It was popular, obviously, in the UK and other countries. But I think that's a really good point. We certainly don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, throw all private enterprise capitalist principles out when we think about neoliberalism. But certainly unrestrained neoliberalism has certainly had negative impacts around the world.
Make a comment, Paul?
Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
I was just going to say regarding neoliberalism, the problem is I think the problem is actually what I would call market fundamentalism. And that is an ideology that says that one size fits all and we need to apply the market to everything. And I think it's the exact opposite of what the Soviet Union did. They said the state should run everything, and the West says the market should run everything, and they're both wrong, because there's some things that the market should not apply to. For example, infrastructure, education, healthcare, a lot of things that, and then when you try to privatize these things, you make them worse. So it has a place. Competition. The other thing that happens is crony capitalism, where you get favoritism for certain corporations. And then you have monopolies form. That's another problem. So I think that free enterprise is good, but you shouldn't apply it to everything. And that's what I think that's the mistake that the West is making, is this market fundamentalism.
Yeah. Any other market fundamentalism, I guess. Yeah, that's the philosophy that underlies many neoliberalists. Let's see if the comments up here. Aubrey said, Anja, I think the most of these theories need to be reevaluated. SAP has affected Africa badly. It is not better to remain in poverty. Is it not better to remain in poverty than to be preoccupied with rebellions and wars? Yeah. Okay. Wube's talked about modernization. We've talked a little bit about that.
You can go back to those older comments on neoliberalism if you want.
Let's see, going down. Laban says, SA structural adjustment policy theories negatively impacted Africa, especially Uganda, following the recent surrender of Entebbe Airport to China. Yeah, we talked about that earlier for a $300 million loan. You could say that was predatory lending rather than true capitalist behavior. I think that the port in Sri Lanka, there's a port being built by China there that I think the Sri Lankan government's already defaulted on it. So yeah, that's not quite a case of capitalism or neoliberalism versus non-neoliberalism. It's there's definite manipulation there in terms of the investment in those assets, and then the right of the lender to take control. Let's see. Asia says classical economic theory raises the indigenous middle class in developing countries financial and can promote or contradict affirmative action. I'm not sure I understand that. Raises the indigenous middle class. How do you interpret that question, Gary, or comment?
I'm not quite sure I understand.
Aubrey asks, Paul, are there any no new theories post 2000? Well, yeah, indeed there are. In fact, well, post-development, I guess, is one new theory. There are critical modernist theories, social movement theory, social movements and democracy, challenging the status quo and conventional economic theories. If you want to read a bit about those, the book that I put in the bibliography by Pete and Hartwick. In fact, I've got a copy of it here. If you can you guys, can you see that? So that's a really good resource. I mean, not all of you might be able to access this, but if you can, if you're interested in development theory, I recommend you take a look at this. These guys are somewhat left in their leanings ideologically and economically, but nevertheless, I think they give a fairly balanced treatment. And you can look at some of those post-2000 theories. A lot's happened, of course, since 2000 in terms of economic development frameworks and what's dominant. Let's see. Ndepe says balanced growth versus unbalanced growth is also a key in Africa for the conventional economic theories. Yes, Africa is trying to focus on unbalanced growth due to economic financial limitations. And indeed, that is an assumption or a premise of the unbalanced growth theorists, is that you direct resources and capital not into all sectors, but into specific sectors where you would have a competitive advantage. And if you do what the balanced growth theorists say, and that's invest in agriculture and industry, you're limiting yourself and you're not developing those industries and markets most efficiently. Let's see. So Raymond says, I want to put out one sustainabilism theory.
You missed a comment about that.
I've missed a comment about that. I didn't see.
Right about that. Alicia had a comment right about that.
Aid is the thing that hamstrings us most. Yeah, I think there's a good book called Aid as a Weapon, or a good article I read when I was younger. Aid is certainly not charity. Aid is there to advance and progress the interests of the donor. This is no less the case with China's aid in Africa, or whether it's aid for infrastructure or the US aid in African countries during the 1970s and the Cold War and so on. Gary seems to want to comment on this one. So go ahead, Gary.
I'll just tell you an interesting story from the Caribbean. You may not know, but at one time, Taiwan had the seat for China at the United Nations. And as China was developing, they were starting to compete, to get their seat back. And there was something you could call aid politics. So the Caribbean countries, so basically China and Taiwan were competing for votes in the United Nations. And so one would build, this is what I would call aid politics. One would build a road and another one would build a fishing port and another one would build this. And these countries would go back and forth competing for the aid. But the one thing that would always get their vote is if they built them a cricket stadium. So that was the ultimate. They would build these cricket stadiums in the Caribbean, and that was sure to get their vote. Now I think there's only one or two countries that vote with Taiwan anymore in the UN. China has taken back their seat since the 70s. And there's no longer, I think there's one country, maybe Belize, that still votes with Taiwan. But anyway, just wanted to point how aid, Paul said aid is used for influence. And that's an example that I have personally seen where they're building roads and stadiums and so forth.
Oh, you're muted. Guys, we can't hear you.
I think Dr. Paul is muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now? I see that Alicia was on. Do you have a comment, Alicia?
No, I was just saying we couldn't hear you.
Oh, okay.
I'd like to hear the definition of.
Yeah, we'd like to hear the definition of sustainabilitism by Raymond. I think he's just coined a new theory. We could put in the theories of development textbook.
No, Dr. Paul, I was just coining up a theory of some sort because I see everything in terms of sustainability concept. So I see the world is going into that side. So perhaps all these people who are theoreticians can always think of something in that line of sustainability. You can build it from there to see where it can take us. But it's not that I was thinking seriously. I just coined it.
Hey, I like it. I like it. It's the first time I've heard it. I reckon you should coin that, Raymond, and develop some ideas around it. And maybe you can incorporate SDG, the SDG philosophy into that, and have a critical theory of sustainability in that context. Maybe you could have a little bit of a neo-Marxist post-development leaning on that theory. Anyway, maybe one more comment before we move to group 2. I see Ray. Oh, yeah, Raymond's doing it. I reckon you should do something with that that phrase, that theory, Raymond.
It's very hard to come up with such. It requires a very big team, perhaps, with critics and enthusiasts, and see where it can take us, if it is there in any case. Because it may not take us anywhere, but those who may believe in it might build it to make sense out of it.
Raymond, you said you wanted to be a politician. There's your political platform. It's called sustainabilitism.
Thank you, Gary.
Sorry, one last thing. Ahu Ndape, yeah, please go ahead.
All right, so I just wanted to ask a question, maybe a suggestion. So within the context of maybe the conventional economic theory where we have imports, substitutions and industrialization, I think that it's important for African countries to skew their neoliberalism towards areas where they are in need. That is, is it not possible for us to empower the sectors that we know we can develop in-house, and then the areas that we can compete with others, that should be where we can do liberal trade. If you have competency to compete with another country in a particular area, such that neoliberalism should not be in all aspects, but it should be skewed towards some areas which, you know, having brought in import substitution that is developing the local economy, yet you can still compete for some certain products that is within yourself and other countries. So that was just a suggestion I wanted to bring, maybe for more comments.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's probably a big discussion we probably don't have time to get to here, but thanks for making that, Ndape. So Gary, let's go to group 2, shall we? Which is the neo-Marxist theories. Hope there's no stigma attached to the people that are in this group. Who would like to? Resolution.
Hi guys. We had a very rushed conversation, but what we did is we kind of grouped dependency theory and world systems theory together. We couldn't see too many really big distinctions between the two. We were also a little bit confused because some of us interpreted it as a way of operating almost, while some of us interpreted it as a lens, a way of analyzing the systems of trade. So the strength we found in it as a lens was to be able to identify means of exploitation and identify means by which resources were extracted unfairly from underdeveloped countries. But its weakness that we saw was that it was aspirational towards core countries. So it pushed development along the same lines as core countries in terms of industrialization, and was very focused on the economics of the situation and didn't look more broadly at, as Louise was saying in our group, the local context of some of these underdeveloped countries, their politics, corruption, other factors that may have a very meaningful impact on why these countries are not developing. So that was world systems and dependency theory. Regulation theory, we found a little more palatable because it considered cultural, social, and political aspects of the system, which from one of the readings said that created a self-regulating economy. But the weakness of it is that markets can continually escape to systems that don't enforce that way of thinking. So unless everybody does regulation theory, nobody can do it, is what I saw. And yeah, that was our thinking. Oh, and then Jane tried to make us all look bad and also looked at critical theories. So she brought in the elements of human development approach, and how and the gender equality, and how again this broadened view of not just focusing on the economic was important in order to get an approach that actually created meaningful development in these countries. And that's it from us.
Yeah, great that you covered so much ground there. Dependency theory, of course, world systems theory really built on dependency theory. So they're related theories, probably a little complex, but the world systems theory sees the whole world as one economic kind of market, as one unit, and it divides them up into core, periphery, and semi-periphery. And the system is marked by a differentiated division of labor, where you have cheap labor, unskilled labor in periphery, similar in the semi-periphery, and in the core, of course, that's where all the power and the skills lie. But of course, the weakness of world systems theory is that it doesn't really look at the inequality and the division of labor within core countries as well. And I think in my comment before that since 2000 and the new millennium, inequality and poverty in the United States has increased dramatically, and you do have semi-periphery and periphery conditions in some segments of the population in the US. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. The regulation theory, look, it's something I've always been fascinated in. When I was a student, I read Antonio Gramsci, Selections of the Prison Notebooks, and he's very much, it's a very sociological take on the economy and society. And he was interested in the question of hegemony of economic players and of ideas. And really what he was on about in regulation theory is that each one of us gets bought into a system of the economy, a capitalist system where we regulate ourselves. So we become consumers because we're enticed and we get on that treadmill. And so the government doesn't need to force us with a gun to be capitalists. We are brainwashed. We ideologically inclined to support that system, to regulate ourselves internally. I guess, Michel Foucault, the post-structuralist, we're in his terms, we're policing ourselves. Gramsci was really interesting because his main interest at the time was on the American economic capitalist system, which was Fordism, right? Which was mass production of automobiles. And this was the first time this had ever happened in the world, is that the capitalist system became very efficient and was churning out these goods, and that people wanted to be part of this system because they could become consumers. So he looked at that, and that was his analytical lens. So I do like regulation theory. It has applicability absolutely in the modern era for understanding what reinforces systems, what reinforces systems of domination. Anyway, so look, anybody else have any comments on those theories, on those neo-Marxist theories? It was a good summary, by the way, so thank you.
I'll make a comment about something.
Who?
Can I make a comment?
Gary would like to comment.
So Paul was talking about Fordism, and I just wanted to point out that Ford tried to create something in South America called Fordlandia, I had never heard about this till recently, and the idea was that they were going to, he was going to have mass production of rubber plants, and it was a complete failure. He wasn't able to pull it off. So what works in one, someone mentioned this earlier, what worked in one context, which is mass production of automobiles in the United States, and did not work in another context of trying to grow rubber in the tropical area of South America. So it's a quite interesting story how it was an absolute failure for Landia.
Great, Gary. Let's see some of the comments that have come in. Specifically on this one. There's so many comments. You guys are so engaged. It's hard to keep up with them. Let me see. Anybody would like to comment on the neo-Marxist theories in particular?
The stigma of neo-Marxism is clearly lingering.
Any other comments?
Yeah, well, let me say something about the stigma. Just a mute, please, Paul. There you go. You know, during the Cold War, which I lived through because I'm old, one of the worst insults you could call anyone in the West was by calling them a communist. And it's still true. I have colleagues here from Colombia, and because they have a Marxist rebellion, it's considered an epithet to call someone a communist. And so you're right, there is still that stigma, but you know, in economics, there is a lot of actual Marx was a classical economist. He recognized all of the, you know, the benefits of capitalism. He also pointed out the flaws. But the K, when you do economics, K stands for capital, and that's because Marx wrote the book on it called Das Kapital. So there is a lot of validity in that, even though that that stigma from the Cold War does still linger, as Alicia pointed out.
Okay, guys, I think we could go on talking about this for ages, but we are getting toward the end of the session, and we still have to discuss the critical theories of development. And within that category, we've got post-development theory, the human development approach, and one of the main gender and development or women in development approaches, gender and development, GAD. So could the nominated speaker or speakers please say a few words?
Yeah, here's Zanilena. Can you hear me? At the moment.
Thanks,
okay, yeah, so yeah. I'll speak for room 3. I guess our room of much discussed about critics around theories of development, critical theories of development. And then we've discussed about past development theories, where we'll start. So, sorry, most of the group I've explained about what are the different development theories, but here from now, we're not saying that the post-development theories, even at somehow it's close to the imbalance theory, when acknowledging that there is oppression and oppressors. The post-development theories, if in summary, much says that describe that describe a rejection of the past development theories, as Dr. Rogers said that it's the most recent one at the moment, and it's actually rejecting the past development theories and practice, and insists that development initiatives on the whole did more harm than good to the world. And by saying that the post-development is not actually an anti-development theories, as the very main distinction is about, is where an anti-development school of thought much stay in a position where they bring a critical backward-looking approach, where a post-development approach is much looking for a more forward-looking constructive approach, and with which is more optimistic. But then, as a critical theories of development, the critics much stand on the belief that the actual development theories has failed when we face the reality that the decades of attempts to reduce poverty and remove inequality around the world have not been achieved so far. So post-development theories pointed that the actual says underdeveloped way of life is not even absolutely presented as undesirable and inferior to the developed way of life. So it will not be so easily, that's what it will be not so easy to dismiss that underdeveloped way of life will be completely undesirable for everyone. But it has much promote that the Western, I don't talk about Westernization, the Western way of life, but what's the word? The northern countries, present as developed, is not compulsory what all the other countries want. And as the theory of dependency already stated that indeed the actual underdeveloped countries is trending to a completely different way than the developed countries did. So which ultimately should lead on another way of thinking about what development means. And that's where the post-development theories reject and say that have a lot of concern about the Westernization. And when we pointed that the development for all on itself is just impossible, because it seems that the development of some part on the West, or how the Western say, because it seems that the development of some parts was at least at some extent predicated on the exploitation of the other parts. So almost it's the post-development theorists want to say that diversity is an asset on itself. So as long as there is diversity, surely alternative ways of living is also an evidence. And on that, what you want to go is to propose another alternatives to the actual development theories. And the first things that you want to defend is that defend the local and reject the Western way of life. And by defining the local, there's slogans that they argue saying that think globally and act locally. And this kind of slogan is things that is proposed as an alternative development. But then the weakness on that is that because it's maintained that diversity exists and each country will have their own path to reach development, it puts a limitation where it is become impossible to start to bring a standard or real concrete alternatives of our developments, when each country will much have to find their own path to reach development. And this is what the post-development theory said about where are the critics about development theories. But even the UNDP with their human development approach also argue that actually development cannot be measured through wealthy economy only, when the UNDP on their human development reports much promote that development should be measured through three main dimensions. First is the decent standard of living, so it's measured by GN index, and long and healthy life, about life expectancy of person, and measure for expectancy index, and knowledge, much about the education index, and and schools for everyone. So based on that, just say that all the development theories arguing that wealthy economics and neoliberalism will ultimately not be the only ways to reach development for all countries. And that's where also, the gender and development want to come in, as actually all the development theories doesn't take into account gender inequality, where it has been seen that women roles in economy is pro-efficiency and have proven their capacity to bring their own contribution to the economy. And then we've started to move quite quickly from now on the question about, is there any opportunities for development mineral sectors? And through shares we got that we've seen that actually when all these critics say that when the neoliberalism and capitalism is in some way first things for all countries, the post-developed these theories on critical theories, when they are much promoting locals, it's, for our point of view, created some space for development minerals to really be an alternative development for all the countries, when on that point there will not necessarily be conflict between the actual capitalism and the neoliberalism, but a much promotion of local development through local commodities and empowering local industries through development minerals. And let's say we've moved on for the country where it comes, those are countries, government, for which kind of approach countries government follows. Actually, when we've already said that neoliberalism is things to accept, especially for underdeveloped countries which are highly dependent on IMF and the World Bank. So compulsory, the neoliberalism is still almost our government approach, but it is also, we're also seeing that it's much a combination of several approach, where we have seen that even not so much support is given mostly to developed minerals as we've seen as an opportunities, but the locally first politics, it seems to be quite part of actual government politics for development and underdeveloped countries. So we want to say that there is some mixed approach on first to be part of the neoliberalism, and I've seen that capitalism is work at some point, but then hereafter forced to see as well that it doesn't solve all the issues completely. And I've started to look again on alternatives and how to promote the local content to reach the development. And unfortunately, for the last question, last thing is about where does government support development minerals? Haven't talked much about that. Maybe some of our team, our members want to bring more comment in, because we haven't been as a group been able to talk a lot about the development mineral sectors and government support. And yeah, I think that's it. I hope I've covered everything. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ondje. You've just given a very detailed, you've covered all the ground. You've made some great points, and I think you've really captured the theories, the three theories that we've identified there. I actually wasn't expecting you to go into that much detail, but that's really good. Would anybody like to comment on the critical theories of development? Anybody have any comments on any of them, whether it's human development or post-development? That's Arturo Escobar, the Colombian, or gender and development. Does anyone have any comments? How these might be important for the development mineral sector, maybe? Any hands up? Gary said he had another comment.
Yes, Paul.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
I personally think that Africa still places a lot of emphasis on religion, spirituality, and their faiths.
You're on mute, Aubrey. You must have hit mute.
That was basically just that I think there's a lot of emphasis on their religion and spirituality.
That's all I want to say.
Okay, yeah, good point. And I think that, a similar thing can be said for India. Those things, you don't just have economic man. What do they say? Homo economicus, you have spiritual man too, and you can't separate the economic aspects of those societies from the spiritual aspects of those societies. Maybe that's a difference between China and India in terms of economic development and their projections and their paths so far. You know, under communism, of course, at least under the Chinese system, there's not a large place for spirituality or for religion. And neither was there under the Russian, the USSR, the Russian system as well. Does anyone else have any comments? We're getting very close to the end, guys. It's been a really good, interesting conversation. Great to see you all so engaged in the material, and really gets us thinking and challenging with rare opportunities like this to really think about development and the different ways in which it's thought about, and the different criticisms. Do we have any? Oh, Anja, please go ahead.
One of the things that we have asked during our room, inside our room, is about to say is that somehow the new theories of development seems like to just sell the wine, the old wine in new bottle, but we haven't been exactly about to figure it out. So maybe someone can bring a comment in on that point. Thanks. You are on mute. Yeah.
The new wine in old bottles. Yeah, I think that's a great old wine in new bottles. I think that's a really good way of putting it. And somebody wrote, "Oh, how about selling old wine in bottles?" Yeah. Anybody want to comment on that?
I had a comment on Anja.
Yeah, just something that Anja said about the development mineral sector. Because it's so overlooked, in one way, it's a bit of an advantage because there's going to be possibly less conflict over these materials than there might be over something like gold or cobalt or something like that. So actually, that is an advantage. And also the fact that it's not subject to international trade, it's going to be less subject to these neoliberal rules. They're going to be less foreign competition. And I think that those are some advantages. Neoliberalism kind of overlooks it. So in a way that it has those advantages. And then regarding the critical theories of development, just keep in mind that as the film I showed the other day pointed out, that the neoliberal is a market philosophy, and therefore it only recognizes things that have prices, and therefore it only recognizes money. It doesn't recognize any other values. So that's where the human development approach comes in, because it recognizes other things like health and education. And then the gender issue, of course, so many issues about the work that women do, the reproductive work and raising children and so forth. So those are all things that you can't put a price on. That just occurred to me. There's a book that someone at Tufts wrote, actually, Julie Nelson. It's called Knowing the Price of Everything and the Value of Nothing. So just remember that not everything is measured in money, and that's what neoliberalism does, and it distorts our thinking. So we have to really keep that in mind.
Very good, Gary. I think if there are no more comments, we have 3 minutes left, Gary, for you to wrap up this part of the course. But I just wanted to thank everybody for dialing in and for your real engagement and interest in the material. And I hope the development theories stuff, it is slightly removed from the development minerals debates, I guess, the issues, but it's what we've tried to do is make some of these linkages to help you think about development minerals and local development in potentially new ways. So I thank you all for your participation, and I'll hand over to Gary to wrap up. Thanks all.
Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate that. Regarding the next 3 days, so we have completed the 6-day essentially the 6-day training portion of the course. The next 3 days are all going to be about organizing the projects. This is the first time we've run through this. There may be some glitches if we don't work out everything in the next 3 days. We have plenty of time. I'll be available to help make be a liaison with the project partners. So if everything doesn't go perfectly, we'll continue after the course is over, and we can try to make these arrangements. But I'll just go to the prep work for day 7. Oh, I also want to mention those of you who have attended, who are not originally in the project portion, but if you have attended every session, then I would invite you to be to let me know if you want to be in the project section, and you will be invited to that section. So let me know if I've invited quite a few already, but if you have attended every session and you want to be part of the projects, just let me know, and I will put you into the project section of the course. And Paul's getting a lot of thanks on the chat. Thank you so much for recognizing his work today. Okay, so I'll just share my screen real quick. Okay, so the prep work for day 7. This is a presentation that I will give tomorrow. You're welcome to preview it. I've also included the project forms, so I hope you'll download these forms, and this is what we're going to use to develop your projects for the next couple days. And then the next thing is I have listed every one of the project partners, and I want you to go through and look at all these projects and pick which one you want to work on. Most of them have a description. I'm missing a few. So anyway, you can go through. Most of them have some kind of a description, and then you can decide which one that you want to that you're going to want to work on. And that's pretty much it for the day, unless you have additional questions. And if not, I will thank you again for your participation, and I will see you tomorrow. And Alicia is asking whether mentors should indicate a project. Absolutely, yeah. Pick a project that you want to be working on, and for sure, everyone needs to pick a project that you would like to do. A question, must we select a project that's in our country? No, but you should pick one that's in your time zone, because otherwise the communication might be difficult. I have put the country for each project. Generally this session, which is the evening session, I think the time zones are going to be the Philippines, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Cameroon, and Zambia. That's Dr. Tong Palan, Dr. Mamus, Dr. Kweko, Professor Chinje, and Dr. Meiti, and also Wilson Mwandira from Zambia. So most of Africa and the Philippines are going to be in the more this time session. In the earlier session that we did in the morning is going to be Fiji, Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, and possibly Ghana, because it could go either way. Question, is there a limitation? I would say generally I found that 5 people is the upper limit on a group if you want to be productive or efficient, I should say. So we'll figure that out tomorrow. You can tell me which ones you want to be, and then we'll figure out if there's too many in one group. As far as contacting the project leaders, they're going to be attending tomorrow, and hopefully you can exchange your contact information at that time. So tomorrow, hopefully all of the project team leaders will be here, and the ones that are in this time zone, and you'll be able to talk to them directly and ask them questions. So we're going to spend the next 3 days making these agreements with the project leaders. So you should have plenty of time to communicate with them. So can we select anyone? Yes, you can select anyone. Are all the projects listed? Yes, most of them are listed. I have a few that haven't sent me any explanation, but most of them, if you look in the website in the preparation for day 6, all of the projects should be listed there. Okay, come back with the leader of this time zone. Eventually, all of your contacts are shared. Well, I did not, I sent all the communication through anonymous communication, blind CC, because I didn't want to violate your privacy. So any communication that you do, you'll have to do in your breakout groups between each other, so you can communicate with each other. Noel wants me to come back with the leaders in this time zone. And once again, I've got them listed in the website, but I would say Dr. Tongpalan in the Philippines, Dr. Mamus in Zimbabwe, Dr. Kweku in Ghana, Professor Chinje in Cameroon, Dr. Meiti in India, and Wilson Mawandira in Zambia. That's 6 projects in this time zone. So you should be able to pick there. I think that I handled all the questions. If that is it, I will just say thanks again, and I'll see you tomorrow.